Welcome to the History Maps podcast. You conquer half the known world on horseback, only to realize your prize is a cluster of ancient, walled cities that you have absolutely no idea how to run.
Right, which is a completely different skill set entirely.
It really is. And that is the core geographical paradox of the Chagatai Khanate.
Mm.
Because, when we look at historical maps, we usually expect cohesive spaces.
Yeah, borders that make logical sense.
Exactly. Borders that follow a mountain range or maybe a major river. But the middle section of the Mongol Empire is just something else entirely. It is essentially a forced marriage between two utterly incompatible ways of living.
We are looking at a territory where a nomadic ruling class, so people who had perfected mobility and logistics on the open steppes, were suddenly responsible for governing millions of sedentary people.
People who had lived in the exact same irrigated, heavily fortified urban centers for literally thousands of years.
Yeah. And the administrative whiplash of trying to manage both of those landscapes simultaneously is really the defining feature of this entire deep dive.
We have a very deep stack of sources to pull from today to figure out how they managed this balancing act. We are looking at intricate historical texts detailing the shifting borders, plus some detailed economic analyses of their taxation systems drawn from Turkish source material.
And we also have some very recent genetic research.
Yes, the DNA research.
Right, research that uses ancient DNA to pinpoint the precise geographic origin of the Black Death, which ties directly into the infrastructure of this specific Khanate.
So the mission here for you listening is to trace the history of the Chagatai Khanate, because, quite simply, without it, the modern demographic and linguistic map of Central Asia just does not make sense.
No, it doesn't. And to trace that map, we really have to start at the exact moment the Mongol Empire fragmented. So in 1227, Genghis Khan died.
Right.
A massive empire had been built through all this rapid conquest, but it lacked a standardized bureaucratic method for succession. So the territory was divided among his four sons, creating distinct appanages, or ulus.
And Chagatai was the second son.
He was. And his inheritance was geographically staggering.
I mean, we are talking about a stretch of land starting from the Altai Mountains in the east, which border modern-day China and Mongolia,
all the way to the Amu Darya River in the west,
which snakes right through modern Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan.
Yeah, the sheer scale of it is difficult to even process, but the more pressing issue for Chagatai was the environmental divide within those borders.
Because it wasn't just one type of terrain.
Exactly. The northern half of this inheritance consisted of the vast Kazakh steppes. So this is grass. Endless rolling plains that are just ideal for pastoral nomadism.
Which is what the Mongols knew best.
Right. For the Mongols, this was entirely familiar territory. They knew exactly how to extract value from herds of horses, sheep, and cattle, just moving with the seasons.
But then you cross into the southern half of the territory.
Yeah, you cross into Transoxiana. That is the land bounded by the Sirdarya and the Amu Darya rivers. And this is not steppe.
No, not at all.
It is an environment of extreme arid deserts, punctuated by these massive, heavily irrigated oases. And sitting right within those oases are some of the most ancient and wealthy cities in the world.
Places like Samarkand, Bukhara, Tashkent.
Right. These places were the engines of Islamic scholarship, complex Persian bureaucracy, and intense agricultural wealth.
Okay, so if you are Chagatai, you have a very serious problem on your hands. It is like you inherit a massive, sprawling estate. And half the property is a working cattle ranch, and the other half is a densely populated commercial tech park.
That is a very apt way to look at it.
You just cannot apply a single set of management rules to both operations. If you try to run the tech park like a cattle ranch, like if you treat urban merchants like nomadic herders, the entire economy collapses.
And the Mongol leadership fully recognized that reality. They knew their traditional methods of governance were completely ill-suited for managing a complex urban agrarian society.
So they needed a workaround.
Exactly. The solution they developed is known in the sources as the Inja system. It was a dual administrative approach, and it was designed to maximize wealth extraction without forcing either population to adopt the lifestyle of the other.
So how did the mechanics of that Inja system actually work on the ground?
Well, in the northern steppes, up among the nomadic populations, the Mongols maintained strict, direct control. They governed by the Yasa.
Which was Genghis Khan's codified legal system.
Right. The Yasa dictated everything: military organization, hospitality laws, hunting rights, and it was enforced rigorously. The nomads essentially continued their traditional way of life under traditional leadership.
But the cities down in the south got a completely different rulebook.
They did. The approach in the southern urban centers was remarkably hands-off. The Mongols allowed the local populations to just continue their daily lives governed by Islamic law, Sharia.
So they didn't try to force the Yasa onto the urban populations?
No, not for day-to-day civic matters. The civic disputes, local commerce, market regulations, all of that was managed by the existing Persian bureaucracy. The local elites largely remained in place.
There has to be a mechanism for the Mongols to get their cut, though, right? I mean, a hands-off approach in the south sounds like a great way to let your subjects get rich while you stay poor on the steppe.
Oh, they definitely got their cut. The mechanism was tribute and taxation, and it was enforced by a network of officials called daragachi.
Daragachi. So these were essentially Mongol overseers.
Overseers or governors stationed right in the cities. A daragachi did not care how the local mayor settled a property dispute between two merchants. They weren't there for local justice.
They were there for the money.
Precisely. The daragachi's sole purpose was to ensure the city formally submitted, the census was taken accurately, and the taxes were collected and sent back to the Mongol court.
So Chagatai is essentially saying, look, let the tech park run itself. Just make absolutely sure the profits are sent up to the ranch house.
And the thing is, Chagatai actively preferred the ranch house. He was a very strict traditionalist. He had absolutely no desire to sit on a throne in a palace in Samarkand.
He didn't want to become a sedentary king.
No. He established his court, his orda, in a nomadic encampment at Al-Malik, which is up in the Ili River Valley. He wanted to preserve the purity of the nomadic lifestyle.
So he viewed the sedentary world with a degree of suspicion, basically.
Highly suspicious of it. He valued the sedentary world only for the wealth it could generate to fund the Mongol war machine.
And that wealth generation leads us right into the economic engine of the Khanate. Because this geographic split wasn't just a local administrative headache, it sat directly atop the most lucrative trade network on the planet.
The Silk Road.
Right.
The Chagatai Khanate occupied the absolute geographic bottleneck of the Eurasian trade routes.
You couldn't avoid it.
You really couldn't. If goods were moving overland from the Yuan dynasty in China heading toward the Ilkhanate in Persia or moving up toward the Golden Horde in Russia, they had to pass through Chagatai territory.
The sources really emphasize the Pax Mongolica here, the Mongol peace. The idea is that by bringing the entire Eurasian landmass under a single overarching authority, the Mongols essentially eliminated the fragmented local banditry that usually plagued merchants.
And security is the ultimate commodity for a merchant. A caravan carrying high-value, low-weight goods, silk, porcelain, spices, precious metals, they faced immense risk on the road.
So the Mongols provided that security.
They enforced it with draconian severity. Under the Mongols, the punishment for banditry was death. Full stop. For a merchant, that guarantee of safe passage meant unprecedented profit margins.
Even after paying the Mongol taxes?
Even after the taxes, yes. It was worth it for the security.
Let's actually dig into that taxation, because the Turkish source material details a very specific organized system. This wasn't just warlords demanding a chest of gold whenever they rode into town.
No, it was a highly structured extraction system. Now, initially, the Chagatai economy was somewhat overshadowed by the Great Khanate back in Karakoram.
Right, the central authority.
But the Chagatai quickly developed local revenue streams. The foundation of this was the Kopker.
The Kopker. What was that specifically?
Originally, this was a distinctly nomadic tax. It was levied on pasture land and based on the size of a herd. It was essentially a wealth tax for the steppe.
But you cannot levy a pasture tax on a silt merchant in Bukhara.
Exactly, which is why they implemented the tanga. This was the commercial tax.
Okay, so who paid the tanga?
It was levied on merchants, artisans, and goods moving through the cities and along the trade routes. It was essentially a combined sales and transit tax.
Right.
And then for the sedentary farming communities in Transoxiana, they extracted the kalan. This was a heavy agricultural land tax based directly on crop yields.
I do want to push back a bit on a narrative that often pops up when discussing the Pax Mongolica. We hear about this booming trade, but did the Chagatai rulers actively build economic infrastructure to foster that trade?
Oh.
Or were they primarily acting as a highly organized cartel, extracting tolls from systems that predated them by centuries?
That is a crucial distinction. They were primarily extractors. The cities, the complex irrigation networks, the merchant guilds, those were ancient. The Mongols did not invent them.
Just co-opted them.
They co-opted them entirely. However, they did implement one massive piece of infrastructure to facilitate their control and to secure that extraction.
The YAM system?
The YAM system, yes. It was a vast continent-spanning network of high-speed postal and supply stations.
And these stations were spaced roughly a day's ride apart, right?
Roughly, yes.
Yeah.
And it was designed fundamentally for rapid military and political communication. A courier carrying an imperial decree could ride a horse to absolute exhaustion, arrive at a YAM station, instantly swap it for a fresh mount, and just continue riding without stopping.
The speed of that must have been terrifying to their enemies. Information moving that fast across Eurasia was completely unheard of at the time.
It was unprecedented. It allowed them to coordinate military campaigns across thousands of miles. But the YAM stations also served a secondary economic purpose.
How so?
They acted as secure way stations for merchants who carry the appropriate safe conduct passes from the Mongol authorities. The YAM provided food, shelter, and fresh animals to those merchants.
Which is highly efficient.
Right.
But it brings us to the most unsettling part of this entire economic setup.
Right.
The very infrastructure that made the Chagatai Khanate enrich the YAM system inadvertently functioned as a biological distribution network for the deadliest pandemic in human history.
The Black Death.
Yes. Historically, the origin of the plague was just vaguely assigned to the Far East. The general assumption was always that it started somewhere in China and slowly made its way west.
But the genetic research provided in our sources completely upends that timeline and that geography.
This is the 2022 study by Spiro and colleagues.
Yeah.
And the methodology here is just fascinating. They did not just look at old texts. They actually analyzed ancient DNA from human remains in two specific cemetery sites.
Karjagak and Tolyak. Both of those sites are located near Lake Issyk-Kul, which is in modern-day Kyrgyzstan. Crucially, that sits entirely within the historical borders of the Chagatai Khanate.
And what did the researchers find there?
They found tombstones in these cemeteries with Syriac inscriptions explicitly stating that the individuals buried there died of pestilence.
And these graves are securely dated, right?
Yes, to the exact years 1338 and 1339.
So they extract DNA from the dental pulp of these skeletons, which apparently acts as an incredible preservation chamber for ancient pathogens. And they find Yersinia pestis, the bacteria responsible for the plague.
They did, but the breakthrough wasn't just finding the bacteria itself. It was the specific genetic makeup of this strain.
Right, because there are different strains.
Exactly. The genetic analysis proved that the bacteria found in those specific graves was the ancestor strain. Biologists track the evolution of pathogens by looking at mutations. And at a certain point in history, the Yersinia pestis family tree experienced a massive divergence.
A sudden explosion of new strains.
Geneticists call this the four-way split, or the polyemy.
The moment the bacteria mutated into the specific variants that would go on to devastate the world.
And the strain found in the Chagatai Khanate sits at the precise root of that four-way split.
That is a critical detail.
It is. The genetic data indicates that this specific geographic region was ground zero. The disease was likely endemic to local rodent populations, perhaps marmots, up in the Tian Shan Mountains. It mutated, jumped to humans, and hit those local communities in 1338.
And from there, the highly efficient Mongol infrastructure takes over.
The YAM system. You have relay riders moving at these unprecedented speeds. You have merchant caravans constantly stopping at these stations, interacting with local populations, swapping horses, trading goods.
And fleas carrying the bacteria are just hitching a ride on the horses, the riders, the grain sacks, the textiles.
So the disease boards the express train, essentially.
It really does. The speed of communication directly dictated the speed of the infection.
The plague radiated outward from the Chagatai Khanate directly along the trade routes. It moved west to the Golden Horde, devastating the cities along the Volga River.
And it traveled south to the Ilkhanate in Persia as well.
Right. And from the Golden Horde, it reached the trading port of Kaffa on the Black Sea, where Genoese ships carried it into the Mediterranean, which triggered the massive European outbreak.
So the wealth of the Khanate was built entirely on connectivity, and that exact connectivity weaponized a local rodent disease into a transcontinental catastrophe.
It is a dark irony of their infrastructure.
It is. But to maintain that connectivity in the first place, to enforce the taxation and protect the YAM system, the Chagatai needed a massive military deterrent.
And they had one. The wealth extracted from those sedentary populations funded an incredibly sophisticated military machine.
The Chagatai military didn't invent new structures, though, did they?
No, they strictly adhered to the decimal system initiated by Genghis Khan, which was a masterpiece of social and military engineering.
This is the organization by tens. Walk us through how this actually functioned on a structural level.
Okay, so the base unit was the Arban, which was a squad of 10 men. 10 Arbans formed a Jagun, which is a company of 100.
Okay, multiplying by 10.
Exactly. 10 Jaguns made a Mingan, a regiment of 1,000. And 10 Mingans constituted a Tumen, which was a massive division of 10,000 soldiers.
On paper, it sounds like pretty standard military logistics. But
Yeah.
the brilliance of the decimal system wasn't just administrative, was it? It was psychological.
It was highly psychological. It was a tool designed to deliberately break down ancient tribal loyalties.
Because before Genghis Khan, a warrior fought alongside his family.
Right. He fought with his brothers, his cousins, his clan chief. His primary loyalty was strictly to his tribe, say, the Naaman or the Petar. So if the clan chief decided to retreat during a battle, the whole clan retreated.
So how does the Arban, the squad of 10, change that dynamic?
By forcibly mixing men from different, often historically rival tribes into a single squad.
Oh, wow. I mean, that is a significant shift.
You put a Naaman, a Tatar, and an Ongud in the exact same tent. You make them share food, maintain their horses together, and fight shoulder to shoulder.
And there are harsh penalties for breaking rank.
The Yasa stipulated that if one man in an Arban fled the battlefield, the other 9 were executed.
That is just brutal. You are forcing them to rely entirely on the man next to them for their very survival.
It completely overrides whatever clan politics their chiefs might have had back home. The loyalty is forcibly redirected from the tribal chief to the immediate squad, then to the military commander, and ultimately to the Khan himself.
It transformed a fractured confederation of tribes into a single, unified, meritocratic army. And the instrument of that army was the horse archer.
The Chagatai military was fundamentally a light cavalry force, and their primary weapon was the composite recurve bow.
Now, this was an astonishing piece of technology. It was not made from a single piece of wood like an English longbow.
Right. No, it was a laminated construction. You had animal horn on the belly of the bow, wood in the core, and animal sinew on the back. And all of this was glued together and cured over months.
The physics of that construction are intense because the sinew wants to contract and the horn resists compression. So it stores a massive amount of kinetic energy in a relatively short weapon.
It had an incredibly heavy draw weight, and it could accurately fire arrows up to 300 meters.
And crucially, because it was relatively compact, a warrior could fire it rapidly in any direction while sitting in the saddle of a horse at a full gallop.
Which brings us to the tactical application of this weapon. The sources get into specific maneuvers, particularly the caracole.
How does a cavalry unit execute a caracole in the chaos of a battle?
It was a rotating volley technique designed to inflict maximum casualties without ever engaging in hand-to-hand combat. So imagine a line of Chagatai cavalry charging toward an enemy formation. As they close the distance, they release a synchronized volley of arrows. But instead of crashing into the enemy line with swords, the riders immediately wheel their horses away, circling back to the rear of their own formation.
And while they are circling back, they are reloading.
Exactly. And as they wheel away, the second line of cavalry is already charging forward to release their volley.
So it creates a continuous, relentless, localized storm of arrows.
It degrades the enemy's armor, it kills their horses, and it completely breaks their morale. All while the Mongol cavalry remains completely out of reach of enemy swords and spears.
And if the enemy formation holds through all that, or if they decide to charge out and attack the circling Mongols, that triggers the other signature tactic.
The feigned retreat. This was absolutely the deadliest maneuver on the steppe. The Chagatai cavalry would suddenly break formation, they would drop their weapons, scatter, and flee in apparent panic.
So to an undisciplined enemy commander, it looks like a rout.
It looks like victory. So the enemy breaks their own defensive lines to chase down the fleeing Mongols.
But they get strung out. The fast horses get ahead of the slower infantry. The command structure just falls apart in the excitement of the chase.
And once the enemy is thoroughly disorganized and overextended, the fleeing Mongols abruptly wheel their horses around. Suddenly, the disorganized pursuers are surrounded by a highly coordinated cavalry force.
The trap snaps shut.
The trap snaps shut, and the enemy is annihilated piecemeal.
Okay, those tactics are undeniably brilliant for field battles on the open steppe. But if you have an army optimized entirely for mobility in open space, How on earth do you police and control a massive, heavily fortified urban center like Bukhara? You cannot execute a caracol maneuver in a narrow, winding city street.
You don't even try. The Mongol military was incredibly pragmatic. They recognized immediately that their light cavalry was useless for siege warfare or urban policing.
So what did they do?
They incorporated the specialized skills of the populations they conquered. When they needed to take a walled city, they conscripted local auxiliary infantry and highly trained siege engineers.
They used local labor.
Right. They used conscripted laborers to build trebuchets, dig siege mines, and eventually deploy early gunpowder devices to breach the walls.
And once the wall is breached and the city is taken, the control mechanism shifts from military tactics to psychological and legal administration.
The memory of the initial Mongol conquests was the primary deterrent there. The populations knew that resistance meant absolute destruction, the razing of the city, and the massacre of the inhabitants.
So if you submitted and paid tribute, you survived.
Exactly. To manage this vast network of compliant cities and nomadic tribes, they relied on a sophisticated system of diplomatic tools.
This is where we see the physical artifacts of empire, the yarliks and the pesa.
A yarlik was a written imperial decree. It was stamped with the Khan's seal, detailing laws, tax exemptions, or military orders.
But the pesa was the physical manifestation of the Khan's authority.
The safe conduct tablets, yes.
What did they actually look like?
They were heavy tablets, usually made of silver, gold, or iron, and they were worn prominently on the belt of an envoy or an official.
And what did they signify?
The inscription on the paisa essentially stated that the bearer spoke with the literal voice of the Khan. If an envoy rode into a yam station wearing a gold paisa, he had immediate authority to commandeer the best horses, demand provisions, and compel local leaders to obey his orders.
It was a diplomatic immunity and executive authority wrapped into a single piece of metal. But who was actually carrying these tablets?
Usually high-ranking nobles, and they were often chosen based on complex kinship and clan ties. The internal politics of the steppe clans functioned as the diplomatic core of the empire.
So they negotiated alliances, arranged marriages, and settled disputes using a very specific cultural framework.
Yes.
Yet, despite having the most fearsome military on the planet,
Yeah.
strict laws, and these physical tokens of absolute authority, there was a fatal flaw embedded in the DNA of the Mongol system. And it basically guarantees that the Chagatai Khanate is locked into a cycle of devastating internal conflict.
Right. The entire system fell apart the moment a ruler died. The Mongol Empire suffered deeply from the lack of clear primogeniture.
Because in a European kingdom, when the king dies, the eldest son usually inherits the throne. The rules are generally known.
But in the Mongol system, succession planning was apparently not written into the Yasa. It was essentially a free-for-all among the ruling family.
The mandate to rule belonged to the golden lineage, right? The direct descendants of Genghis Khan.
Yes, but any male descendant could theoretically claim the throne. The succession was determined by whoever could gather the most military backing and convene a Kurultai.
Which was a political and military council of the elites.
Exactly.
Which means every transition of power is preceded by a civil war.
It was institutionalized instability. When Chagatai died in 1242, the infighting began immediately. And it wasn't just a local problem.
The great Khans were involved.
The great Khans sitting in Karakoram, the supreme rulers of the entire Mongol Empire, constantly intervened in Chagatai politics. They would depose one Chagatai heir and install another, deliberately keeping the middle section of the empire weak and subservient.
So the middle section is acting as a buffer zone, and the great Khans want to make sure the buffer doesn't develop teeth.
Precisely. But the broader Mongol Empire couldn't maintain its own stability either. In the 1260s, the whole machine fractures.
The Tuluid Civil War.
Right. This was the massive, empire-breaking conflict between two grandsons of Genghis Khan. On one side, you have Kublai Khan, who had established his power base in China and eventually founded the Yuan dynasty.
And he wanted to shift the center of the empire eastward into the sedentary world.
He did. On the other side is his brother, Arik Buk.
Arik Buk represented the traditionalists.
Yes, he commanded the forces in the Mongol homeland and wanted to maintain the capital in Karakoram, keeping the empire rooted in nomadic traditions.
This presents a massive opportunity for the Chagatai Khanate. Two superpowers are fighting each other, which means nobody is policing the middle.
A Chagatai prince named Algu Khan recognized this immediately. He was initially appointed by Arik Buk to secure the Chagatai lands for the traditionalist faction.
But once Algu had control of the military and the wealth of Transoxiana, he changed his mind.
He turned right around asserted his own independence, and cut off all tribute to the Great Khan. This is the moment the Chagatai Khanate stops being a subordinate province and starts acting as a sovereign, independent state.
Independence is a double-edged sword, though. They break away from the Great Khan, but they immediately plunge into an era dominated by a warlord who completely hijacks the state.
The period from roughly 1266 to 1301 is defined by a man who wasn't even from the Chagatai lineage. His name was Kaidu.
Kaidu.
He was an Ogadide prince, descended from a Darrant son of Genghis Khan.
And Kaidu is an incredibly persistent historical figure. He spends his entire life fighting a guerrilla war against Kublai Khan.
Kaidu fiercely opposed Kublai Khan's adoption of Chinese administrative practices. He viewed Kublai as a traitor to the Yasa. Kaidu wanted to restore the traditional nomadic order.
But to fight a massive power like the Yuan dynasty, Kaidu needed a steady stream of resources, men and horses.
And the Chagatai Khanate is sitting right next door, wealthy and politically fractured.
So Kaidu moves in.
He does. He doesn't officially claim the title of Chagatai Khan because he doesn't have the lineage for it. Instead, he systematically reduces the actual Chagatai rulers to puppets.
Like Barak Khan.
Yes. He installs rulers like Barak, manipulating them, using their armies as his own personal strike force, and draining the Khan's resources to fund his endless wars against Kublai.
The legitimate heirs are essentially hostages in their own empire. How did the Chagatai finally break free from Kaidu's control?
It required immense patience and political maneuvering by a Chagatai ruler named Dua Khan.
Dua was brilliant, from what the sources describe.
He was. For years, he played the role of the loyal subordinate. He fought alongside Kaidu, absorbing military strategies and quietly consolidating his own support among the Chagatai elites.
And Dua doesn't just sit on the defensive. He launches an incredibly aggressive foreign policy to the south, pushing down into India.
The Chagatai invasions of the Delhi Sultanate were massive, multi-year campaigns. Dua sent two-men after two-men across the Hindu Kush. They sacked Lahore, they ravaged the Punjab, and on several occasions they laid siege to Delhi itself.
The Sultanate had to build extensive fortifications and maintain a massive standing army just to survive the Chagatai onslaught.
These campaigns must have poured immense plundered wealth back into the Khanate, which elevated Dua's prestige.
It solidified his base.
It did. So when the aging Kaidu finally died in 1301 after a battle against the Yuan forces, Dua was ready.
He completely outmaneuvered Kaidu's heirs.
He dismantled the Ogadide power structure and finally reasserted true independent authority for the Chagatai lineage. He stabilized the realm and even negotiated a fragile peace with the Yuan dynasty.
There is a profound historical irony at play here. You have a Khanate founded by Chagatai, a man legendary for his fanatical adherence to Genghis Khan's traditional laws. He was the ultimate loyalist. And yet, this very Khanate spends decades allied with warlords, fighting massive wars against the Great Khan, and serving as the primary catalyst for the permanent fracturing of the unified Mongol Empire.
The irony is rooted directly in the very traditionalism Chagatai championed. The mandate of the Yasa was nomadic autonomy and strength. By strictly adhering to that nomadic ideology, the Chagatai rulers became constitutionally incapable of submitting to a centralized, sedentary Great Khan ruling from a palace in Beijing.
To submit to Kublai was, in their eyes, to abandon the essence of what made the Mongols.
Exactly.
While the armies are marching to India and fighting civil wars on the steppe, something equally dramatic is happening quietly within the borders of the Khanate. The political isolation creates a pressure cooker for cultural fusion.
And to understand this fusion, we really have to look closely at the demographic reality on the ground. The social hierarchy of the Chagatai Khanate was highly stratified.
Because the Mongols themselves were a tiny demographic anomaly within their own empire.
They were a minuscule ruling elite. Below them, making up the bulk of the military and the nomadic population in the eastern regions, were various Turkic tribes groups like the Karluks, the Uyghurs, and the Kipchaks.
And then, primarily in the western oases of Transoxiana, you had the massive, deeply rooted, sedentary populations of Persian-speaking Tajiks.
So you essentially have three completely distinct linguistic and cultural groups. You have Mongolian, various Turkic dialects, and Persian.
How does a ruling elite communicate and govern when they are outnumbered 100 to 1 by people who do not speak their language?
The resolution is a gradual, profound linguistic shift. Over the course of a few generations, the Mongol ruling class simply stopped speaking Mongolian.
That is always the most fascinating detail in the history of conquest. A conquering army comes in, takes total control, enforces its laws, and then voluntarily abandons its own mother tongue.
It is an administrative inevitability, really. If your entire army speaks Turkic and your entire bureaucratic tax apparatus speaks Persian, continuing to speak Mongolian just isolates you.
So they adapted.
The Mongols in the Chagatai Khanate adopted the local Karluk Turkic dialects spoken by their troops and their nomadic subjects. Simultaneously, they relied entirely on the sophisticated Persian language for court diplomacy, poetry, and urban administration.
The collision of these languages doesn't just result in bilingualism, though. It actually births something entirely new.
It creates the Chagatai language. This emerges as a highly standardized, literary Eastern Turkic language.
How does it function mechanically? If I am looking at a document written in Chagatai, what am I actually seeing?
You are looking at a language written in the Arabic script. The grammatical foundation, the chassis of the language, so to speak, is distinctly Turkic.
Okay.
But the vocabulary engine, the words used for administration, philosophy, courtly love, and poetry, is heavily borrowed from Persian, along with Arabic religious terminology.
The sources highlight some specific milestones that prove this wasn't just a street dialect, but a high literary language.
Right. Around 1341, a poet named Qutb Tabisi achieved something monumental. He translated and adapted the classic Persian romance epic Khosrow-o-Shirin into the Chagatai language.
Translating a Persian epic into a Turkic language is a massive shift. It proves the new language has the poetic vocabulary and emotional range to handle high literature.
Exactly. It demonstrated that Chagatai was not just a language for giving orders to soldiers, it was a language of high culture, and this literary tradition flourished.
Who are some of the key figures later on?
By the late 15th century, you have brilliant figures like Mir Ali-Shir Navai. He didn't just write poetry in Chagatai, he wrote extensive theoretical treatises arguing that the Chagatai language was just as expressive, nuanced, and structurally sophisticated as Persian.
It is impossible not to compare this to the evolution of English after the Norman conquest in 1066.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. You have a ruling elite, the French-speaking Normans, who violently conquer an old English-speaking population. They hold absolute military power. But over centuries, the elite gradually adopt the local language, injecting it with French and Latin vocabulary.
And the result is modern English.
A rich, hybrid literary tradition that completely outlives the political empire that created it.
And just like English, the Chagatai language became the lingua franca of Central Asia. Long after the Khanate itself collapsed, Chagatai remained the language of diplomacy and literature across the region for centuries. The linguistic legacy was a profound success.
Cultural blending of language is one thing. You can mix vocabularies without starting a war. But when an empire starts tampering with religion, the foundation cracks. Religion proved to be the ultimate stress test for the Chagatai Khanate.
The fracture really begins to show during the reign of Quebec Khan, who ruled from 1318 to 1325.
Quebec seems to be a ruler who looks at the chaotic warlord era and decides the state just needs to modernize and stabilize.
He was a highly pragmatic administrator. He recognized that the Khane's wealth depended heavily on the stability of the sedentary cities. He implemented sweeping economic reforms. Most notably, he introduced a standardized silver coinage across the realm.
The coins were literally called the Quebec, right?
Yes, a standardized currency reduces the friction of trade. But Quebec didn't just reform the economy. He shifted the geopolitical center of gravity.
He physically moved away from the steppe.
He moved away from the traditional nomadic encampments in the east and built a palace near the urban center of Samarkand in the west.
He is physically moving the seat of power and integrating deeply into the Persianate sedentary side of the administration.
He is signaling a major shift in priorities. And that shift sets the stage for his brother, Tarmashirin Khan, who ruled from 1331 to 1334.
And Tarmashirin takes Quebec's sedentary leanings and pushes them past the point of no return.
He converts to Islam.
And he doesn't do it quietly. He takes an Islamic name, Ala-ad-Din.
He fully embraces the religion, the culture, and the customs of the sedentary majority in Transoxiana. He relocates the capital to the urban center of Karshi. But the most inflammatory decision he made was abandoning the Toyn.
What exactly was the Toyn, and why was abandoning it such a massive issue?
The Toyn were the traditional annual assemblies of the Mongol nomadic elite. It was a time when the clan chiefs gathered, renewed their oaths, discussed military strategy, and reaffirmed their connection to the steppe and the Yasa.
So by refusing to attend or host the Toyn, Tarmashirin was essentially telling the eastern nomadic tribes that their traditions no longer mattered to the central government.
Right. We have to look at this from the perspective of a traditional Mongol clan chief out in the Altai Mountains. To them, the Khan has taken an alien name, moved into a walled city, adopted a foreign religion, and refuses to meet on the steppe.
It was viewed as an absolute betrayal.
It really was. The eastern tribes still adhered fiercely to the Yasa and their traditional Tengrist beliefs. They saw Islamization and urbanization not as administrative modernization, but as an existential threat to their identity.
Because the mandate of heaven, the right to rule the world, was given to nomads living in tents, not merchants living in palaces.
It is the ultimate dilemma of the conqueror. If you adapt to the people you conquered in order to extract their wealth more efficiently, at what point do you cease to be the people who conquered them in the first place?
Tarmashirin crossed that invisible line. The ideological rift was simply too deep.
The eastern tribes refused to accept an Islamic urbanized Khan. In 1334, they rebelled. They marched west, deposed Tarmashirin, and murdered him.
And killing the Khan doesn't fix the problem. It shatters the empire entirely.
The murder results in a permanent physical and ideological fracture. By the 1340s, the Chagatai Khanate is split into two distinct halves that will never truly reunify.
In the west, you have Transoxiana.
Deeply Islamic, centered around the urban oases, heavily Persianized in culture, and increasingly dominated by local Turkic emirs rather than the Mongol elite.
And in the east,
In the east, you have Mogulistan. This half remained fiercely nomadic, actively resisting urbanization, and stubbornly holding on to traditional steppe culture and the Yasa.
once that physical split happens, the title of Chagatai Khan loses its supreme authority. The institution hollows out, and we enter the twilight of the empire, characterized by the rise of local warlords.
In the western half, Transoxiana, the devolution of power is absolute. The Ginghisid descendants, the actual heirs of Chagatai, are reduced to impoverished figureheads.
Who takes the real power then?
Real political, economic, and military power is violently seized by various Turkic emirs, the regional commanders who control the local armies.
A prime example being the Emir Kazagan. He takes control in the 1340s, but he doesn't crown himself Khan. Why not? If he has the army, why keep a Chagatai prince around?
Because of the deeply ingrained legal and mystical legitimacy of the golden lineage, the populations, even the Turkic armies, believed that only a man with the blood of Genghis Khan could hold the ultimate title.
And Kazagan was not of that lineage.
No, he wasn't. If he declared himself Khan, the other emirs would immediately unite to destroy him for breaking the ultimate taboo. So he rules from the shadows.
He installs a puppet Chagatai Khan on the throne.
He issues orders in the puppet's name and uses the historical legitimacy of the Chagatai brand to mask his own military dictatorship.
Was there ever a moment where the two halves looked like they might stitch themselves back together?
There was one significant violent attempt. In 1360, the ruler of the eastern half, Tulu Timur of Mogulistan, decided to reclaim the lost territory.
He launched a massive invasion into Transoxiana.
And the western emirs were disorganized. Tuglu Timur actually managed to conquer the territory and temporarily reunite the two halves under one banner.
But the reunification doesn't stick.
It collapsed almost immediately. Tuli Timur died shortly after the conquest. Without his forceful personality, the eastern armies withdrew, and the western emirs immediately rebelled and reasserted their independence.
Plunging Transoxiana back into chaos.
And out of that specific chaos in Transoxiana emerges one of the most terrifying, successful, and brutal conquerors in world history.
Timur, widely known in the West as Tamerlane.
He emerged from the Barlas tribe, a Turkified Mongol confederation operating in the western territories of the fractured Chagatai Khanate.
Timur essentially looks at the ruins of the western Chagatai state and uses it as the foundation for his own conquests.
Timur was a military genius of the highest order. He systematically defeated the rival emirs in Transoxiana. But crucially, he built his massive, sprawling empire directly upon the administrative, military, and geographic foundations left behind by the Chagatai.
He utilized the same trade routes, the same decimal military structure, and the same Persian bureaucracy.
And just like Kazagan, Timur used puppet Chagatai Khans to legitimize his early rule before his own power became absolute, and he established the Timurid dynasty.
That explains the fate of the western half. It gets swallowed by Timur. But what happens to the eastern half? Mogulistan. Do they just fade into the background of history?
That is one of the most remarkable aspects of this narrative. While the wealthy, urbanized western half was absorbed by Timur, the traditionalist eastern half, Mughalistan, persisted as a formidable nomadic power for centuries.
Centuries. We are talking well past the medieval era.
Long past it, the geographic isolation of the Tarim Basin and the harshness of the steppe protected them. They eventually broke down further into smaller regional powers, specifically the Yarkand and Turpan Khanates.
And those political entities were ruled by direct descendants of Chagatai Khan.
They were. They endured right up until the late 1600s and early 1700s. They maintained that direct genetic and political link to the Mongol Empire long after the rest of the world had moved on to gunpowder empires and global naval trade.
And the Chagatai legacy doesn't just survive in the East. It travels south, radically reshaping the Indian subcontinent.
We have to look at Babur, the man who founded the spectacular Mughal Empire in India in the early 1500s.
When Babur needed to legitimize his massive conquest to the diverse populations of India, he leaned heavily on his ancestry.
On his father's side, he claimed descent from Timur, but on his mother's side, he claimed direct descent from Chagatai Khan.
The name of the empire itself is a testament to that.
Exactly. The term Mughal is simply a Persian corruption of the word Moghul, or Mongol. The most famous opulent empire in Indian history, the builders of the Taj Mahal, explicitly tied their dynastic legitimacy back to the legacy of Chagatai's inheritance.
It is incredible to step back and look at the broader historical narrative. The Chagatai Khanate rarely gets the spotlight. The history books focus heavily on the Golden Horde terrorizing Russia, or Kublai Khan establishing the Yuan dynasty in China, or the Ilkhanate sacking Baghdad.
But the Chagatai Khanate, this awkward middle child of the empire, provided the administrative DNA, the bureaucratic software, that ran the next 3 centuries of Central Asian and Indian history.
They were the crucible. The models of dual administration, the synthesis of Turkic military power with Persian civic bureaucracy, the blending of nomadic mobility with urban wealth, these were the exact models that the Timurid and Mughal empires perfected.
Absolutely.
Let's distill the core takeaways from all the sources we have analyzed today. We started with a state defined by a geographical paradox, attempting to manage the steppe and the city simultaneously through the Injo system.
We examined a massive economic engine sitting squarely on the Silk Road, generating wealth through a complex tax structure and the Yam system.
And we looked at the dark side of that connectivity, the genetic evidence showing how the region served as the incubator for the Black Death.
Beyond the economics and the plagues, we witnessed a profound cultural synthesis. The linguistic shift that birthed the Chagatai language and the painful, violent Islamization of the elite created a unique hybrid culture that fundamentally defines the identity of Central Asia to this very day.
When you look at the modern political map, when you look at nations like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, you are looking at the deep historical roots planted by the Chagatai Khanate. The blending of nomadic Turkic heritage with sedentary Islamic traditions is the direct echoing result of Chagatai trying to figure out how to rule his divided inheritance.
You cannot accurately comprehend the geopolitics, the cultural tensions, or the linguistic landscape of modern Central Asia without understanding those centuries of Chagataid rule.
It leaves you with a thought to mull over long after this deep dive ends. Consider how geography dictates destiny. If Genghis Khan had granted his son purely nomadic lands or purely urban lands, the empire might have been administratively boring, but it might have held together much longer.
It was the attempt to force a marriage between 2 completely incompatible environments. The open steppe and the walled oasis, they guaranteed both the Khanate's vibrant, enduring cultural output and its inevitable violent destruction.
You could draw a line on a map, but you cannot force the people living inside those lines to become a single unified entity if the land itself demands they live differently.
A decree from an emperor cannot erase the fundamental difference between a horse and a plow.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.